chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. It says, Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people to the children of Israel out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob, the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, the land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now, please, let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give to this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold and jewelry and clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and your daughters. So shall you plunder the Egyptians. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. So there are times where I have forgotten pretty important things. I was visiting with Cheryl's grandma and Bridget's grandma too, Betty Anderson, a couple years back, and it was kind of about 9:30 in the morning, and we were having a good time, just talking, had a great conversation, and I was supposed to be back over here to teach a Bible study at 11 o'clock. well, we were having such a good time talking and enjoying each other's company that I looked at my clock and it was almost 11:30. And I'm still sitting there at Betty's house. And I was supposed to be here teaching Bible study. Now that's the first time and the only time I've ever forgotten completely about Bible study. It's pretty bad when you're supposed to be the one teaching it. Okay, that was pretty bad. But just recently, the last church council meeting that we had scheduled, I knew it. I scheduled it. I knew it was on the schedule. It was on my calendar. But it was a time where I had Dade County Social Services and the Social Security Administration running me all over the place like a wild goose. And I just had all kinds of stuff hit me that day. And then right after supper, right before that meeting, I got this serious phone call about a serious situation. And it's a long conversation. And by the time I finished that phone call, I completely forgot about that church council meeting. Completely forgot. I didn't think about it until the next day. That's the first time and the only time I've ever forgotten a church council meeting. But I had already asked for forgiveness about 2 months before that, believe it or not. I told the PPR committee here, the Pastor Parish Committee, I said, look, with everything going on, I am bound to forget something important. And I'm sorry if I do, but please know that I've got all of this going on and it's just crazy right now. And if I forget something, this is why. Please forgive me ahead of time. So anyway, so sometimes we can forget really important things. And after being in Egypt for 400 years, the Israelites, they forgot something really, really important. They forgot God. They forgot who God was. They forgot God's name. And they forgot the covenant that God had with them. Even though they were at first comfortable in Egypt and they were being treated well in Egypt, after a while, the affliction began when a new Pharaoh rose to power and began to afflict them and oppress them and enslave them and use them. And even one that saw them as a threat and began to order their demise, the demise of their firstborn children. They were in a bad situation. But by the end of the 400 years that they were in Egypt, they had forgotten about God. This is a pattern that we will see throughout the rest of the Scriptures as we go through the Bible. We'll see that there are times where the people of God forget about God. Especially when you get to the book of Judges. Now God warns them about this in Deuteronomy 8, but warns them about forgetting about Him. But you see this pattern of forgetting happen all throughout the book of Judges. They'll forget about God, they'll begin to worship other gods, and then they'll get into trouble. Affliction will start. And then they will cry out to God. Over and over and over again. But the good news in all of this is that even though they forget God, and even though sometimes we forget God, and that's really what's going on in the church in America today. If you want to really know what's going on, we have forgotten about God. We don't know, and I say we collectively here, not every single person, but collectively, we don't know who God is anymore. We don't know what God is like anymore. We've begun to worship other gods that we've created in our own image, and that's what's going on today. And we're suffering because of it. And we're in a very similar situation. But even though we forget about God, and we do, and even though the people of God forgot about God in Israel, or in Egypt, the Israelites in Egypt, the good news is that God did not forget them. God did not forget them. He heard their groaning. He heard their cry. And even though there's no indication that it was directed to Him, He heard it anyway. And the Bible tells us that He remembered His covenant. And all of the promises that went with that covenant, the covenant that He made with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Now, have I told y'all yet that the storyline of the Bible is in the family? God, after 400 years, remembered that family line. He remembered the family line. He remembered the promises that he had made. And he began to go to work to raise up a deliverer, to raise up one who would lead them out of Egypt. And it would be this very one that had been saved as a baby from the jaws of certain death at the hands of a wicked king. It would be this baby that was saved named Moses, this Moses who would grow up in Pharaoh's house, who would never abandon his commitment to his own people, who ended up having to flee after murdering a man into Midian. He would go into Midian, God would go into Midian and call this man named Moses that had been saved as a baby to lead his people out of Egypt as he heard the cries and the groaning of his people. So he appears to Moses in this miraculous way to get Moses' attention. Now, we get the impression a lot of times when we're reading the Scriptures that, back then, that's when God was just doing miracles every day. Just nothing but miracles happening every day. That's not true. There's no indication there was a ton of miracles going on for 400 years. But all of a sudden, here, beginning with this burning bush, there will be many more to come, but beginning with this burning bush, God is going to come and remind His people of who He is. And He's going to have to remind and reintroduce Himself to Moses. Moses is like, okay, I kind of vaguely maybe have to know a little bit, but who are you again? And then when God reminds him of who He is and tells him His name and tells him what to tell the people His name is, the name I Am is the basic name here that God gives Moses. Then when He tells Moses what He wants him to do, how does Moses respond? God, you sure you got the right person here? Did you mean to call Joe's so-and-so down the road here? Because ain't no way I'm going to be able to do what you're asking me to do. You got the wrong guy. This is the wrong number. Sorry. And by the way, dude, I love Moses' honesty here. This is the way we oftentimes feel. When there's something we know needs to be done, and it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, and what God is asking Moses to do ain't going to be easy. But He's asking Moses to trust not in his own ability. He's asking Moses to trust in His ability. He's not asking Moses to trust in the power of Moses' own hand. He's asking Moses to trust in the power of God's hand. That's what He's asking. But Moses, knowing that doesn't mean it's going to be easy for Moses. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you and me. If God calls us to do something. God's calling all of us to do something. It may not be the same thing, but He's calling all of us to do something. Sometimes that thing that He's going to call us to ain't going to be easy. It's going to be hard. It's going to be fraught with danger, potential loss and failure. It's there. Moses is scared. God's trying to build His faith. Moses says, look, don't you want to get somebody else? There's a lot of times where we know there's something that needs to be done, but surely somebody else will do it. There's something that needs to be done, but I don't know if I'm the one to do it. When in fact, when we recognize there's something to be done that needs to be done, that may be the very thing, the way that God is trying to get our attention to say, hey, I don't need somebody to do this, I need you to do this. And His promise is this. Even though you're scared, even though of course, Moses was right. He couldn't do that. He couldn't do what God was asking him to do. That's the thing about the story is Moses was right. In his own strength and in his own power, there's no way he could do what God was asking him to do. But God wasn't asking Moses to trust in himself. God was asking Moses to trust in Him. Even right here, this is about grace and it's about faith. Sometimes people get the impression, well, the New Testament, It's all about grace. Old Testament, it was all about works, and God, in the midst of Jesus, changed His mind about things. No. God's plan of salvation here is the same as the plan of salvation for us. We're saved by grace through what? Faith. And the faith here is going to be required of Moses. And God here is displaying great patience. God is oftentimes, all the time, patient with us. God is a God of patience. He's working with Moses. He's patient with Moses. He's accommodating Moses' apprehensions and his doubts. He's making provision for him in the face of those doubts. He's leading Moses to get stronger in his faith. God is a God who is patient. He is full of mercy and long-suffering. He is a God of judgment, but He's a God of mercy and patience first. Now, this is kind of a side point, but somebody was asking me, I was talking about how the Pharaoh who was asking the Hebrew midwives to kill the baby Israelite boys, that's a bad thing. Y'all agree with me on that? That's not a good thing. That's evil. Can we agree? Okay. That's evil. Well, somebody who was taking exception to my sermon, not here in church, somebody on a YouTube thing, was taking exception to my sermon, was trying to make a moral equivalency. This is another Christian. That's why I said we don't really know God. We've forgotten God today. Another person who considers himself a Christian is taking exception and saying, well, if it was wrong for Pharaoh to kill these baby boys, why was it okay for Yahweh later to kill the firstborn in Egypt? And he was making this moral equivalency. Okay, because that's coming later. Here's the difference. Here's what we need to understand. God is a God of judgment, but He's also first a God of mercy. He's a God of patience. And you've heard 3 strikes and you're what? Out. Well, with God, He didn't send 3 plagues and Pharaoh was out. He sent a lot of plagues, didn't He? He gave Pharaoh ample opportunity. Ample opportunity. And at times, Pharaoh actually would say, because he's just trying to let the people go. He's trying to get Pharaoh to let the people go. That sounds so familiar, doesn't it? Some folks don't want to let you go, do they? So he's trying to get Pharaoh to let his people go. And there's times where Pharaoh, after the judgment falls on Pharaoh, it could be much worse than it is. Pharaoh initially says, well, okay, I'm going to go ahead and let him go this time, but then he changes his mind. So there's 10 plagues, if I'm not mistaken, right? Over and over again, God was patient. So to make a moral equivalency with a megalomaniac tyrant committing genocide in the judgment of God is ridiculous, okay? In the judgment of God, a lot of people don't like the idea of the judgment of God at all today, but the judgment of God never goes away. Even though sometimes people get this impression, hey, Jesus comes along and makes all that go away. Jesus is the one. There's only one person in the New Testament who actually talks about hell, and guess who that was? It was Jesus. It was Jesus. If you read the book of Revelation, you see the judgment of God poured out over and over again. The wrath of God and the wrath of the Lamb poured out over and over again, but the point was to get people's attention, to bring them to repentance. But the people refused, like Pharaoh. You see that same pattern. So there's my little tangent, no extra charge. Let's get back to the main point. Although that's important. That's important to understand. There's a big difference here. God is patient. And God is working with Moses. God is accommodating Moses. God is going to allow Aaron, Moses' brother, to work with Moses, to be a spokesperson when Moses feels like he can't speak, until Moses will eventually be able to speak for himself. And He's going to allow Miriam, the one who actually, his sister, who helped save his life as a baby, she's going to be there to help and work and minister as a prophetess there in Moses' ministry. So Moses is being accommodated by God, and he's been called to this great and this mighty calling, but he's not being called to trust in his own ability and his own power. He's being called to trust in the power of God. He's been called to have faith in the mighty hand of God to save. To save. What he's being called to is a daunting task. It's an incredibly hard task. You know, there's a little cartoon I see go around sometimes on social media. It has a pastor standing up in the pulpit, and he's asking his congregation, who wants change? Who wants to see change? And everybody raises their hand. And then he asks, who wants to change? And not as many hands go up. Well, what's even harder than that is who wants to lead people to change? That's an even more daunting and incredibly difficult task. That's what God is calling Moses to do. But the promise is, and listen to this promise, is that God promises him, I will be with you. That's one of the most precious promises in the Bible, in the Word of God, is that God promises he will be with us and enable us and empower us. Even as you see Jesus, before he ascends into heaven in Matthew 28, before he goes into heaven, he commissions his disciples. He is sending them to all nations of the world to proclaim the good news, to make disciples, to baptize in his name, and to teach them to obey all of the commandments. That's not a light task. And his promise, like the promise of God here for Moses, was that, and lo, old King James, behold, I will be what? With you, even to the end of the age. God is calling us to trust him, to trust his presence and his power at work within us. He's calling all of us to do something. He's calling all of us to be something that we maybe are not right now or not doing right now. And we've got to know and trust that it will be by his mighty hand and by his mighty power and not our own that we will accomplish it. And it will be him and him alone that will receive all of the glory. Sometimes we'll go through these periods where Israel, like the Israelites for 400 years, there was not a lot of activity possibly of God, the supernatural. They weren't seeing it. And they began to wane in their faith. They began to fade in their faith. And then God shows up and brings a reminder. Even though they forgot, God did not forget them. God hasn't forgotten you. And God hasn't forgotten me. And whatever he calls us to do, know this, that it will not be by your might and by your strength, but it will be by his and his alone. Amen? Amen. Amen. Our Lord invites to his table